I was 9 years old the first time I understood that love could come with conditions, not the kind parents say out loud, but the kind that settles quietly into the walls of a house, into the spaces between words, until you begin to believe that being loved is something you have to earn. I learned that lesson at my aunt's birthday dinner when I accidentally knocked over a glass of orange juice, and my father looked around the table, laughed softly, and said, "Sophia always has an excuse." Everyone else laughed too. I remember staring at the spilled juice spreading across the white tablecloth and realizing that nobody was going to ask what had actually happened. That moment stayed with me for the next 21 years. My name is Sophia Bennett. I'm 30 years old, and 2 weeks before I was supposed to marry the love of my life, my parents tried to destroy everything I had spent years building. Growing up, I became an expert at shrinking myself. I apologized before anyone asked me to. I chose my words carefully. I smiled when I wanted to cry. Somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that if I became perfect enough, quiet enough, useful enough, my parents might finally look at me the way they looked at everyone else's children. But love that depends on performance is never really love. It is a transaction with changing rules, and I spent most of my life losing that game without understanding why. Then, I met Ethan Hayes. He was 33, a civil engineer with calm eyes and a habit of listening so completely that it almost felt unfamiliar. We met 3 years earlier at a charity fundraiser on a rooftop overlooking the city skyline. 4 minutes after introducing himself, he accidentally spilled sparkling water on my jacket. He apologized with such genuine embarrassment that I laughed instead of becoming irritated. We spent the rest of the evening talking. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was performing a version of myself. I simply existed, and somehow, that was enough. Ethan never asked me to become smaller. He never treated my emotions like inconveniences. When I spoke, he listened. When I was silent, he waited. 14 months after we started dating, he proposed in the kitchen of our apartment. There were no photographers, no elaborate plans, no audience. Just Ethan kneeling on the floor with his grandmother's ring in his hand and tears gathering in his eyes before he even finished asking the question. I said yes, before he completed the sentence. Our wedding was scheduled for the last Saturday of September. The rehearsal dinner would happen the night before at a beautiful restaurant called the Willow House. For the first time in my life, I felt chosen. Not tolerated, not managed. Chosen, and maybe that was exactly what my parents could never forgive. My father, Richard Bennett, disliked Ethan from the beginning. He called him ordinary, said he lacked ambition. My mother, Evelyn, smiled politely whenever Ethan visited and then criticized him the moment he left the room. But by then, I had learned to keep their opinions at a distance. Their disappointment no longer controlled my decisions. At least, that was what I believed. Everything changed 14 days before our wedding. I was leaving a client meeting when my phone rang. Ethan's name appeared on the screen. The moment I answered, I knew something was wrong. His voice sounded careful, almost fragile. He told me that earlier that afternoon, my parents had visited his office without telling me. They had sat across from him and shared something they claimed I had hidden from him for years. I pulled my car into an underground parking garage and turned off the engine because suddenly I couldn't breathe. Then Ethan spoke the words that changed everything. "They told me you had a child," he said quietly, "and that you abandoned them." And in that moment, sitting alone in the silence of my car, I realized that the people who had spent my entire life rewriting my truth had finally decided to destroy it completely. For several seconds after Ethan spoke, I couldn't respond. The underground parking garage around me seemed to disappear. All I could hear was the sound of my own breathing and the echo of a sentence so impossible that my mind refused to accept it. They said what? Ethan didn't repeat himself immediately. He wasn't trying to accuse me. That almost made it worse. They came to my office this afternoon, he said quietly. Your father did most of the talking. Your mother filled in the details. I closed my eyes. And what exactly did they tell you? He hesitated. They said that when you were 24, you gave birth to a child. They said you left the baby and never looked back. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. Not because there was truth in their story, because there had once been a child, and because my parents knew exactly how to weaponize the worst thing that had ever happened to me. Ethan, I whispered, gripping the steering wheel so hard my fingers hurt, there was a pregnancy. But there was never a baby. Silence, not angry silence, not suspicious silence, the kind of silence that comes when someone you love realizes they've stepped into a room filled with pain they didn't know existed. I need to see you, he finally said. I drove to Ethan's apartment that evening in a state that felt strangely detached from reality. Every traffic light seemed too long. Every red light felt personal. By the time I arrived, darkness had already settled over the city. He opened the door before I knocked. I had rehearsed 100 different versions of that conversation during the drive. In every version, I defended myself. I explained. I justified. But the moment I looked at him, standing there with concern written all over his face, all the rehearsed words disappeared. I was pregnant when I was 24, I said. He didn't interrupt. I was with someone named Adrian Walker. Still, he said nothing. He was older, charming, confident. The kind of man who always knew exactly what to say until you realized he only ever said what benefited him. Ethan stepped aside and let me enter. We sat at the kitchen table where he had proposed to me 14 months earlier. I remember staring at the same wooden surface where I had once cried tears of happiness and wondering how many versions of a person's life could exist in the same room. I didn't know what I wanted, I admitted quietly. I was terrified. The memories returned with a clarity I had spent years trying to avoid. Adrian's voice. The hospital lights. The feeling that every decision I made somehow belonged to someone else. When I told Adrian I was pregnant, he didn't yell. He didn't have to. He just kept telling me that having a child would ruin everything. He made me feel selfish for even considering it. I paused. I carried the pregnancy for 4 months. Ethan's face changed. Then I forced myself to say the words I had never spoken aloud to him before. I lost the baby. The sentence sat between us. Simple, brutal, permanent. There was no birth, I said, my voice breaking. There was no child to abandon. There was only a miscarriage. And after it happened, I buried the entire experience so deeply that I convinced myself I could leave it behind. The room remained quiet. I waited for questions, for disappointment, for betrayal. Instead, Ethan reached across the table and took my hand. I'm so sorry, he said. Not, why didn't you tell me? Not, how could you hide this? Just those 3 words. I'm so sorry. And somehow, that hurt more than anger ever could, because in that moment, I realized that he wasn't grieving a lie I had told. He was grieving something terrible that had happened to me. We sat there for a long time. Eventually, I told him everything. About Adrian, about the hospital, about the years I spent pretending that chapter of my life had never existed. And then I told him the part that frightened me most. My parents knew. I whispered. Ethan looked up. Everything? I nodded. My mother drove me to the hospital. The expression on his face changed. not to doubt, to something far worse. Understanding, because if my parents knew the truth, then there was only one reason they would tell him otherwise. And suddenly, neither of us was asking whether my parents had lied. We were asking ourselves why. The answer arrived 1 week later. Not because my parents confessed, not because guilt finally reached them. The answer arrived because someone I had not spoken to in 6 years walked into my rehearsal dinner carrying a manila envelope and the truth my parents had spent 2 weeks trying to bury. The rehearsal dinner at the Willow House was supposed to be the beginning of our celebration. The room glowed with soft amber light. Candles flickered across cream tablecloths. Friends and family laughed softly over glasses of wine. Ethan stood near the bar with his brother, smiling in that quiet way that always made me feel safe. For a few minutes, I almost believed everything would be all right. My parents sat at the far end of the room. My father was already drinking. My mother wore a pale pink blouse, and the expression she always saved for public events, warm, gracious, entirely fictional. They had called me several times after Ethan and I spoke. I had ignored every message. Part of me had hoped they would simply sit through the evening and leave. At exactly 17 minutes past 8, that hope disappeared. The private dining room door opened, and a woman I had not seen in 6 years stepped inside. Claire Monroe. For a second, I honestly thought I was imagining her. She looked older than I remembered. Stronger, too. Claire had been my closest friend when I was with Adrian. She had sat beside my hospital bed after the miscarriage. We had drifted apart. I had not invited her. I did not know why she was there. She walked directly toward me. No greeting, no smile, just my name spoken softly. Sophia. She was holding a large manila envelope. "I need 5 minutes," she said. "Right now." Something in her voice made my stomach tighten. I followed her into the corridor outside the dining room. Then she handed me the envelope. "Open it." My hands were shaking before I touched the papers inside. The first documents were medical records. My medical records, hospital admission forms, discharge summaries, a physician's report confirming the pregnancy loss at 17 weeks. I looked up at Claire. Then, I found the printed screenshots beneath them. Text messages, dozens of them, between my mother and Adrian Walker. The first message had been sent 3 months earlier. My mother asked him to confirm that I had given birth to a living child and abandoned it. I stopped breathing. The next message was Adrian's response. "No, that's not what happened." The message after that came from my mother. "Please reconsider." Another refusal. Another message from her. Another refusal from him. The final message simply read, "Do not contact me again." I read the exchange 3 times, not because I didn't understand it, because I did. My mother had not lied in a moment of anger. She had planned it. She had searched for witnesses. She had tried to recruit them. And when they refused, she created the lie anyway. I leaned against the wall because suddenly I could no longer feel my legs. "How did you get these?" I asked. Claire's eyes filled with tears. "Adrian contacted me," she said quietly. "He said something felt wrong. When I realized what they were trying to do, I drove here immediately." I stared at the papers in my hands. For most of my life, I had believed my parents were damaged people who sometimes made cruel choices. Standing in that hallway, I finally understood something far worse. They had known exactly what they were doing. And they had done it anyway. In that moment, I stopped wondering whether my parents loved me. I finally started asking whether they ever had. The answer terrified me more than anything else. Then the dining room door opened. Ethan stood there. He looked at my face, then at the papers, and without asking a single question, he reached for my hand. "Tell me what happened," he said. So I did, and when I finished, he looked through the open doorway toward the table where my parents were sitting. Then he said 6 words that changed everything. They don't get to do this. I don't remember walking back into the dining room. Later, people would tell me that I looked calm, that I carried myself with confidence, that I seemed completely in control. They were wrong. I wasn't calm. I was simply finished. Finished explaining myself, finished hoping my parents would become the people I needed them to be. Finished carrying the burden of their choices as if they were somehow my responsibility. Ethan walked beside me as we entered the room. Claire followed a few steps behind us. Conversation stopped almost immediately. Forks rested against plates. Glasses lowered slowly onto tablecloths. Everyone sensed that something had changed. My parents looked up. My mother smiled. It was the same smile she had used my entire life whenever she believed she still controlled the story. I walked to the center of the table and placed the manila envelope carefully in front of her. "What is this?" she asked. For the first time in years, I looked directly at both of my parents and felt absolutely nothing resembling fear. "Proof," I said. My father's expression hardened. "Don't make a scene, Sophia." The irony almost made me laugh. A scene. As though the problem was the person telling the truth rather than the people who had spent decades rewriting it. I opened the folder. The room remained silent. I explained the medical records first. I explained the pregnancy, the miscarriage, the hospital stay, the grief I had carried for 6 years. Then I explained what my parents had done 14 days before my wedding. No dramatics, no shouting, just facts. Finally, I placed the printed messages between my mother and Adrian in front of them. My mother's face lost its color. My father picked up the papers. For the first time in my entire life, I watched him struggle to find words. "You contacted Adrian," I said quietly to my mother. "You tried to convince him to lie about a child that never existed." She looked around the room. At our guests. At Ethan. At Claire. Anywhere except at me. "I was trying to protect him," she whispered. "Protect him." The words landed with such absurdity that several people at the table actually inhaled sharply. "Protect him from what?" I asked. She finally looked at me, from making a mistake. There it was. Not regret, not apology, not shame. Just honesty. For the first time, she admitted what I had always suspected. She had never been trying to protect me. She had been trying to control me. My father stood abruptly. "This conversation is over." "No," I said. My voice remained calm. "It ended a long time ago. Tonight, everyone else just gets to hear it." The silence that followed felt enormous. Then Ethan stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice either. He simply looked at my parents and said, "You tried to destroy the person I love. You don't get to be part of our future." The sentence settled over the room like a final verdict. My mother began to cry. For years, those tears would have destroyed me. That night, they changed nothing. I looked at both of them and realized something extraordinary. I no longer needed them to understand what they had done. I no longer needed them to love me. I no longer needed their permission to be happy. "Please leave," I said. Neither of them argued. My father folded the papers slowly and placed them back on the table. My mother stood without looking at me. Then they walked out. Just like that. The room remained silent for several seconds. Then someone began clapping. I turned. It was Ethan's mother, Margaret. Slowly, others joined her. The applause spread through the room until everyone was standing. Everyone except me. Because I wasn't celebrating. I was grieving. Grieving the parents I had spent 30 years trying to earn. Grieving the daughter I had been while trying. The next morning, I married Ethan. He cried during his vows. I waited until he finished before I cried during mine. Claire sat in the front row and handed me a tissue at exactly the right moment. And for the first time in my life, I understood something that changed everything. Family is not always the people who raised you. Sometimes, family is the people who stay after they've seen the truth. If this story touched you, remember this: when someone spends years rewriting your truth, walking away is not failure. Sometimes it's the first chapter of your real life.